Hello and welcome to this Radix video. Today we're speaking to Simon Zadek. Simon currently works for the United Nations Development Programme and is also a visiting professor at Singapore Management University. Today we're talking to him about a project that he led, sponsored by the United Nations Environment Programme, on injecting sustainability considerations into the global financial system. And we're talking to him today about how to go about achieving systemic change on a global scale. So Simon, we're here to talk about your project on achieving a sustainable financial system. What did the project achieve?
So finance is the lifeblood of the global economy, but somehow had stayed outside of the centre frame of discussions about sustainable development. So we talked about energy system transitions, food systems, building mobility, but somehow finance got a free pass in being encouraged to finance those areas, but not really think about its own sustainability characteristics. I think the UNEP Inquiry, along with many others, over a 4-year period changed that and placed not just financial and capital markets, but finance as a system at the beck and call of sustainable development.
So you were trying to achieve systemic change in a whole global system, which is quite a task. So what's your theory of change underlying your efforts?
I'm not sure if you'd call it a theory of change, but let me kind of spell out what I think we did in the case of the UNEP Inquiry. So we started by deciding not to focus on specific financial flows, but on the rules of the game. Most obviously the roles of central banks, financial regulators and others, both formally and also the likes of credit rating agencies and others that effectively shape a large part of financial decision making beyond, of course, the particular project in question. So focus on the rules. Secondly, we located our work with a view that there were 3 or 4 drivers of the way financial and capital markets were changing anyway that we needed to leverage. So instead of heading to New York, which is where one would normally go, or London in order to change things on the ground, we headed east to China. We went to Bangladesh, Peru, Kenya, South Africa, Argentina, where different innovations were emerging that were not overly controlled by, let's say, incumbent interests that were much more present in the case of, say, global financial centres like New York and London. And then I would say is that one can't really blueprint the answer. What one can do is to nudge and experiment and crowd in innovations and begin to shape an ecosystem that is an alternative way of understanding the way financial and capital markets work. So rather than setting out, here are 5 things that have to happen and that would define a sustainable financial system, we seeded many different innovations around the world, crowded them into common space so that they could interact with each other and find their own synergies between each other, and from that begin to describe an emergent practice that one could identify as the characteristics of a more sustainable financial system.
So if I understand correctly, this is a very different approach from the usual one, which involves let's do a prototype, do a pilot project, and then scale it up.
I think piloting is looking for the winning formula and then trying to do it in as many places as possible. I think prototyping and crowding in innovation is actually not looking for the winning formula, but is assuming that many different innovations will find their own dynamic and that a more complex system of success will evolve.
In all these change projects, the forces of the status quo are usually quite strong. So how did you overcome that?
I think we looked for alternatives to the incumbents that had potential power and influence. At the beginning of our work, there wasn't a single governor of a major central bank on the planet that was willing to talk about climate change and sustainable development. Again, instead of going to the Fed We went to the People's Bank of China, and eventually to the Bank of England as Mark Carney began to explore his work in the context of climate change. We brought the two together, encouraged them to figure out how to collaborate, albeit from very different types of financial systems and realities. And eventually the Chinese took that partnership with UNEP to the G20.
How important was timing in terms of your achievements with the project?
I think it's of paramount importance, and I think subject to uncertainty, luck, and hard work in equal measure. If we had begun the inquiry in 2009, people within the financial community were facing existential questions and would have had little bandwidth to focus. Perhaps if we started in 2016 in the middle of a huge bull market, equally, too much profit making, easy money would have made it much harder in order to concentrate on this agenda.
So your project was time limited. With a time limited project, how do you ensure that there is sustained change once the project is over?
It's great, really. We promised that we would be a pop-up think tank that would go away and leave others to get on with the job after a period of time. And I would argue that was a critical ingredient of our success, although I'm sure alternatives would have been possible. We were able to draw together an unruly and ambitious coalition of actors, in part exactly because we were not seeking to take long-term institutional space, but were offering opportunity to shape a narrative that would ultimately benefit them in their long-term work rather than us.
So your project was done under the umbrella of UNEP, a United Nations agency, which no doubt gave you quite a lot of convening power. People took your calls because you were phoning on behalf of a United Nations project. How important was that in making the project a success?
It's interesting, really. Proximity to the core is a critical feature of success. If you're too close to the core, it becomes more and more difficult to get stuff done. After all, why didn't the World Bank do this work? Why didn't the IMF take it forward? Why didn't the OECD do it rather than UNEP? For goodness sake, an environmental organisation that's part of the United Nations, hardly a stalwart of the financial system. On the other hand, if we'd been an esoteric think tank, sitting on the margins, saying interesting things, promoting wild ideas, very difficult to really convene the characters, as you say, that need to be part of the solution. So UNEP, perhaps coincidentally, was, from a proximity point of view, in about the right place. It wasn't too close to the core that it was subsumed within incumbent interests and in many ways suppressed from doing this work, but it wasn't so far from the core that it was too exotic and offbeat to really be able to convene the right actors.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Simon. That was very enlightening. Thank you for your time and good luck with your UNEP.